often say to people at home, if you want to sleep the night, start at the beginning. If you don't want to sleep the night, start at the end. Because the last story in this book is not a nice story. I'll tell it to you. Because I have only one book, you see, the rest of them are all gone. And you know probably about the Irish famine of 1845, 1848. It killed over 1 million people. Now, people are people, whether it be in China or Russia or Ireland. But in Ireland, that was a quarter, it was an eighth of the population. Because, you know, there was only 7 million people in Ireland. And over 1 million died or immigrated. It was the most traumatic thing that ever happened in Ireland.
Transported in chains to Australia.
An awful lot of them.
Yes, quarter of a million.
Oh yes, yeah, and the rest, well, either died of famine or cholera. It was an awful. It hasn't been forgotten yet, even though it happened a century and a half ago. And the last story, partly is about that, and it's the parish next to me. It's about 4 miles up the road. That'd be 6 kilometres. And I heard that from an old man there. He said that in that parish, things weren't too bad. He said only about half the people died. No, things weren't too bad. Only about half the people died. So you can tell what it must have been like in other places. But what made it all worse was that their local weaver died. Now, you see, you know, weaving, that was the only way you could clothe yourself at the time. You got your wool from your sheep, or whatever it was, you took it to your weaver, he wove it into cloth, then you took your cloth to your tailor, and he cut it to your design. Not like today, where you can go into any shop if you have the money and buy what you want. That time, it was a long process. You had to go through all these various things until you got what fitted you. Now, their local weaver died. And that was, you know, something horrible, because now, not alone were they going to be starving to death, but it looked like they were going to go naked as well. It was, you know, it was horrible for them. But this particular day, they saw a man coming the road with his pack on his back. And of course that frightened them, because they wondered, who was he? A stranger. And you wonder, why would that frighten them? Because they thought he might be bringing cholera. Now, more people died of cholera in the epidemics of cholera than actually died of starvation. And when they saw him at a distance, you know, they shouted out, "Who are you? What do you want? Where are you coming from?" And that went completely against the grain in Ireland, because Irish people were very hospitable. They would always welcome a stranger. But the famine changed all of that because of the cholera. And your man shouted, you know, that he was from the north somewhere. "But what do you want?" "I'm a weaver." "A weaver? Oh, Jesus, you're welcome. Just what we needed. Our own weaver is dead." And they welcomed him. And, you see, their own weaver's cottage was standing, and the loom was already there. He could move in immediately, and he turned out to be an excellent weaver. Their own weaver had been a very crude man. Crude, you know, the cloth he'd weave for you, and Christ, was like the sail of a ship. You know, you'd be scratching and tearing yourself. He wasn't a great man. But the new fella, he was. He'd weave patterns into the cloth, he'd weave various kinds of cloth. He was good at his job. And in no time at all, there was a queue coming to his door. Once the word went out, he was good. He was good. There was a queue coming from miles around. Anyway, time passed on, and the money was coming to him. You know, he was, you know, but after a while, of course, the local women were feeding him. Oh, he'd pay them. He had the money to pay them. But he got this notion into his mind. Why shouldn't I feed myself? And he tried to rent out a piece of ground. Because again, he had the money to do it. But when he inquired from local farmers, none of them would rent any ground to him. And he was insulted. And he said, here am I, serving you well, making good cloth for you, and you won't even rent me a small bit of ground, huh? He didn't want to buy it, just rent it, in order to grow potatoes for himself. He said, well, I'll go someplace else where they'll appreciate me. And they said, hold on, no, it isn't like that at all. But we can't. Look at the size of our little gardens. We'd love to rent it to you, but our gardens and our properties are too small. And of course it was true, because gardens that time were only tiny. They had all been subdivided into small little holdings. But they said to him, look, go up there to Murphy. He has 30 acres. He's the biggest holder in the parish. If he can't give you something, well, 'tis a poor thing. So he went up to Murphy anyway, Mr. Murphy, and he said to him, look, Mr. Murphy, will you give me an acre of ground? That would be about, what would it be in metric? It doesn't matter. A good holding anyway. And he had gold, he had gold in order to rent it. And Murphy, of course, clever operator, when he saw the gold, no problem at all. And he says, yeah, I'll show you now, no problem, no. And he pointed up there, up the hill, at a fort, a fairy fort. There's your garden. Now, of course, he expected the weaver, but the weaver, wherever he had come from, he just walked up, looked at the fairy fort and said, lovely, Mr. Murphy, thank you very much. And of course Murphy, yes, she said, what kind of a man is this, that he'd set potatoes in a fairy fort? And the neighbours were all the same, He must be from a very strange place entirely. But, anyway, the neighbours all said to the weaver, hey, hold on a minute. Don't tell us you're going to plant potatoes inside the fort. He says, look, if the fairies interfere with me, he says, there'll be a reckoning. He went into Gort, the nearest town, that day. He bought a new spade and seed potatoes. And again, the neighbours, the following day, when he came up to plant them in the fort, one of the neighbours said, hey, have you any respect at all? You take the roof off of the fairy's house. Roof, he said. You see that spade, brand new shining spade. I'd take the skin off of themselves with that if they interfere with me. And of course the neighbours, they had enough done, they had their warning given, off they went about their business. This was no ordinary man. He planted the potatoes, he dug the ridges inside the fort, and I can tell you, that particular year, the neighbours were much more interested in his garden than in their own. What was going to happen here? Anyway, time passed and the stalks came up. Now, of course, at that time, everybody would be interested in the little green stalks. Would the blight come out again? Would there be black spots in them? If there was, it meant another year of hunger and starvation. But inside in the fort, in his garden, there was no black spots, lovely green leaves. And they grew, and they grew, and they grew. And you know yourself now the height that potato stalks grow. If they're healthy, about that height, and then the flowers come out, and summer goes away, and they wither away, and then it comes time to dig your potatoes. And these ones grew and grew and grew, and grew, and grew, and grew, and grew, until they were about the height of the ceiling. And people from 5, 6, 10, 15 kilometres away came to see them. What in God's name is this? What kind of potatoes is going to come out from under these? And eventually, when it came time at the end of summer to dig his potatoes, there was a mob of people there to see what was going to come here. Anyway, the day came when he came with his spade and started to dig. But when he started, there he was, and everybody thought, is he getting weak? or is there stones in it? But they knew there was no stones because they had seen him planting the potatoes earlier in the year. And eventually, you know, something came up. But it was no ordinary potato. It was that size. You know, the cucumbers that they use for Halloween, it was about 6 times the size of one of those. And the local people that were looking at this said, holy Lord, what is it? And the next one was the same, and the next one. Now, when you're digging potatoes inside in a garden with a spade, you're bound to cut some of them. You know, you can't avoid it. And what do you do with the ones you cut? Just use them first, before they're rot. They're perfectly good. But this one, he cut one of these, you know, it was so big, he had to cut one of them. And if he did, what came out of it? Blood. Blood. And the local people again, off they went. And your man took no notice. He thought, some local variety. Different juice. And he cut a couple of more of them down along. Again, took no notice. And that evening, he couldn't lift them home. He had to roll them home in front of him. They were so big. And he pitted them, covered them up for the winter. And, he took no notice. But the following morning, when all was finished, above in the fort, somebody came to collect a piece of cloth that he was weaving. And normally, the same weaver was a very precise man. If he told you call on Tuesday at 10 o'clock, be there. He was that kind of a man. So this man from just above Cool, is the next parish there, about 3 miles away. He was told, be there tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. And there was the man. And he knocked at the door, no answer. And he knocked again, no answer. And just then a neighbour passed outside and he said, what's wrong? He told me be here, but there's no reply. He must be out the back. We'll look. They looked out the back, no sign of him. They tried the door, and if they did, out against them came this vile stink. Oh, God, get the priest. Now the priest lived nearby. They got the priest, and the priest came, and the priest went in. Now, that same priest, he had been very used to going into houses during the famine where whole families were dead of starvation and sometimes eaten by the rats. So he knew what it was like to go into horrible places. He went in, and of course, but he went in, the kitchen was empty. He went down into the room, and there was the man, the weaver, in the bed. Now, he wasn't dead, but you could tell he was in a bad way. He was there. And the priest just shouted to the fellows outside, get the doctor, get the doctor. And they ran into Gort to get the doctor, while the priest, I suppose, said whatever prayers wasn't just in case the man might die. The doctor came out from Gort, the nearest town, and the doctor just said, we'll have to take him into the workhouse. That was the hospital at the time, which they did in the doctor's sidecar. And when they arrived at the workhouse, the matron, of course, she said, well, doctor, what have you for me? This. They took him in, scrubbed him with soap, old carbolic soap, the rough soap, and the stink was back in 5 minutes. Now, the matron said, we can't put him into the ward with the other patients. He'd stifle them. So what they did was, they put him in under the stairs into an old closet. They put in a mattress, stuck it in there, and they said, look, the surgeon will be here tomorrow. He'll look at him. That was fine. The doctor left. He was left there under the stairs, and the surgeon came in the morning. Now, I tell you, in the workhouse at that time, they didn't care too much about an Irish person. You didn't get much of a meal in the workhouse. There were so many people dying that your lifespan in a workhouse was what? Very little, very little. people died like dogs in the
No,
workhouse.
half of that.
Huh?
Half of that time.
I suppose. And I used to always say that nobody wanted to die in a workhouse. If you died in a workhouse, it meant that you hadn't a friend left in the world. But in any case, the surgeon came the following day. The surgeon took one look at him. There, yeah. He opened his bag, took out a jar of ointment, gave it to the matron and said, rub that to him 3 times a day. Went about his business. And when the surgeon was gone, she wasn't going to do it. She called one of the young nurses, a country girl, and she says, that's your job now. Rub that to him 3 times a day. And she did, the poor girl did. And that evening, the girl, with the little bit of food that she got in the workhouse, not much, I guarantee you, she came with the tray and the jar of ointment. And there was your man inside and the stink off of him. And she straightened him up, and when she tried to feed him, and I suppose did, after that she took the jar of ointment and she started rubbing it to him like she had been told to, but wherever she rubbed the ointment to him, his hair started to fall out. Any place there was hair on him, his hair started to fall out. And of course she ran to the matron, to tell about it. And the matron only told her, just do what I told you. Good and busy. Just do. Morning came, and she went back with his breakfast on the tray and the jar of ointment. Now, he didn't look very pretty at this stage. No hair, no eyebrows, no hair. But she did what she was told to do. Straightened him up, tried to feed him his breakfast, and then started rubbing his, with this, whatever was in the jar. And she noticed that all his skin was coming away. Like you get a bad dose of sunburn, All the skin was coming away wherever she rubbed this stuff to him. And she ran back to the matron, to tell the matron. And of course the matron said, go away, just do your job, I'm busy. I have other things to be doing. Well, she did, even though it was a lovely thing to try to do, but back at lunchtime, she came back again, wondering what would she find this time, and straightened him up, no hair, skin peeling off, and she found that he wouldn't eat. And she said, please, come on, I have other work to do. And she had a lot of work to do. There were so many people waiting to be fed. And all of a sudden he started spitting out teeth. All his teeth had fallen out. Now, how they hadn't choked him during the night, it's hard to figure. But all his teeth had fallen out. And of course, again, in panic, the poor girl ran to the matron. No, she shouldn't have, because she got no sympathy, only go away, I'm busy. The same story again. And the poor girl, when it came to that evening, and came to supper time, she went back with her tray and the jar of ointment, and she straightened him up again. And the poor man, he had like the drowning man's grip on the blankets. And she was a kind girl, country girl, and she just to relax. She was here to give him his supper. But he didn't relax. And it was then she noticed all his fingernails on the blanket. All his fingernails had fallen out. And she was about to go when whatever made her do it, she lifted the bottom of the corner of the blanket as she was heading for the door. And yes, there were all his toenails at the bottom of the blanket. His fingernails and toenails had fallen out. There was no point in reporting it to the matron, because you know what she would have said, the same as usual. But that girl came back to give the poor man his breakfast the following morning, and when she tried to straighten him up to give him his breakfast, the poor man was as stiff as a board. inside in the bed, dead. So, instead of he taking the roof off of the fairy's house, as he promised, and taking the skin off of them with his new spade, they took the skin and the nails and the hair and the teeth and the very life from him. So he made a very foolish boast. You shouldn't. The fairies are concerned. If you have an opinion, keep it to yourself. Well, the Irish fairies anyway, because here you're not dealing with, Tinkerbell and little fairies at all. You're dealing with something else entirely. You're dealing with something that can be dangerous. Not if you mind your own business, but if you make threats. You're making threats against the wrong people, because they are people. They are people, and older people in Ireland, as well as younger people in Ireland, respect those. Because in the year 2000, just to show, in the year 2000, that's only 12 years ago, a road costing €20 million was diverted in order to make way for a fairy bush. Ishkach, they call that in Irish. Ishkach. They were bypassing Ennis, and this fairy bush was in the way. And they had a little bit of a controversy over it. Naturally, I knew about the bush, and I brought it to their attention. And after quite a publicity campaign, I told them that if they carried the road that way, there'd be a lot of deaths. And they did, in fairness, after the publicity, they varied the road slightly, and the bush is still there. The bush is still there. Now, in most European countries, that would not happen, I guarantee you. But it shows, that the belief is still there, and it's nice to see that that belief is still there, and that things can be done. No, is there any question, please, if you have? Because the next story, if you have time, I have a short story here for you, yeah.
Is it possible to make friends with this fairy?
No, when you say that, yes. Yes, in the sense that by doing a favour, you might, but you can never trust. You can never trust. They have their own agenda, and you can never tell, because as shows in that book, there are several stories that people come to terrible tragedy by one small slip up, some little mistake, and they come to grief, and they didn't mean to. So whether you can really make friends or not, may be temporary, but as most of the old people said, you'll be better off to have nothing to do with them, because sooner or later it might come back on yourself, since we don't know enough about them. I think most of the older people would say, let them be. Let them be. Because after all, what do you want from them? Treasure? Gold? I think there's better ways of getting it than that. I think there are. Rob a bank.
What about just the curiosity?
It's probably a less controversial way of doing it in the long run. These are more dangerous. There was this woman here, Biddy Early. She was, some of you indeed have heard of her, because her name is known all over Ireland. She was an amazing woman when it came to helping people against the fairies, the good people as they would be called. And many people came to Biddy, at their wit's end about the fairies, what can I do? And Biddy quite calmly would tell them, how do you get out of this one? And, she did tell them, if you do such and such and such, you'll save yourself from this. Because she seemed to know and did help people. For example, the story that I recall, there was a man living near Kilkishen in Clare, and his name was Gasty Mac. Gasty would be Augustine, which would be just a shortened version of Augustine. And his name was Gasty Mac, and he died. And of course, his wife was at her wit's end because they were poor people. And all the time that Gasty was dead and laid out inside in the bed, before the wake and the burial, there was these black and white birds, I suppose magpies, and they're pecking and pecking and pecking and pecking at the thatch and throwing down ribs of straw out of the thatch. Now, one of the neighbours said to Mrs. Mac, why don't you go to Biddy? And Mrs. Mac, I suppose she was in desperation. They had no children. She was in desperation. Why? But I suppose when your husband or wife dies, you're not thinking properly. And she let herself be taken to Biddy early, about 12 miles away, 15 kilometres. And when she arrived at Biddy's house over an isle in Faker, as soon as she came, Biddy told her immediately, your husband is dead, isn't he? And all the time that he's dead, or all the time that he was sick, because he had been sick for about 15 days, fading and fading until he finally died. There's these birds above on the thatch, pecking and pecking, throwing down pieces of straw off of the thatch. Well, she said, they're not magpies or any birds, they're the fairies. And 'tis the fairies now have your husband carried. And if you want to save your husband, you'll do what I'll tell you. Go home and order a coffin from Tulla and get the 4 strongest men in the parish and get 4 black-handled knives. They have to have black handles, mind, she said. And put the black-handled knives into that coffin. Now the black handles must be pointed towards the corners and the blades into the centre. And then take the thing that's inside in the bed that looks like your husband. And now remember, she said, that isn't your husband. It just looks like your husband. It is only a changeling. Put that thing in on top of the knives. Screw down the coffin as you would normally in any coffin, and get the 4 strong men to take that coffin up on their shoulders as far as the crossroads that's 200 yards from your door. Now, here's the part that's important, says Biddy. Let no relative of yours touch that coffin while those men are taking that coffin to the crossroads. If any relative or yourself touches it, my cure is no good. So anyway, that was grand. He said, come home then, and you'll find your husband sitting by your own fireside as good as ever he was. Mrs. Mac was delighted, of course. She came home, ordered the coffin from Tulla, which is the nearest village to Kilkishen, and got the 4 black-handled knives, did as Biddy told her, put them into the coffin, black handles out, blades into the middle of the coffin, and told the 4 strongest men in the parish to be there. They came, and then they put in the thing in the bed that looked like Gasty Mac, her husband, in on top of the knives. Now remember, the knives were flat into the coffin. Put the man in the bed in on top of the knives. They screwed down the top of the coffin, and when dawn came, well, they took the coffin on their shoulder, brought the coffin out, of course, and outside the door, took the coffin on their shoulders and they started walking towards the crossroad, which was only 200 yards away, which would be, what, 300 metres away. But Mrs. Mac was behind it, saying her prayers, as you would expect, and with every step they were taking, the weight in the coffin was growing and growing and growing and growing until by the time they were 2/3 of the way towards the crossroads, it seemed there was 2 tons of weight in the coffin, and the coffin began to slip off of their shoulders. Now, they were the strongest 4 men in the parish, and yet they began to waver, and their knees began to wobble under them. You know, it seemed like they were not going to get to that crossroads no matter what. And what do you think? Mrs. Mac, of course, like any person would, natural, you know, when the 4 of them stopped, and they were doing their best to hold up the coffin and it going off from their shoulders. Mrs. Mac, you know, she up with her 2 hands to support the coffin. Immediately, the coffin rose up as light as a feather, and they were able to go to the crossroads, you know, like that with it. They put down the coffin in the middle of the crossroads, unscrewed the 4 screws, curiosity, and there, inside the coffin, was a brush. Mrs. Mac took one look at it, ran home. No sign of her husband at home. He was gone. He was gone. This time, the fairies had him taken for good. He was never seen again. And if she had done what Biddy had told her, she'd have saved her husband from the fairies. So, you know, you had to do precisely what Biddy told you, and there was no second chance. And changelings were believed in. That, you know, that the fairies could take a person and leave something behind that looked like the person. Mainly it happened to children, but it could also happen to adults. And Biddy was the person whose, you know, people came to, thousands of people came to her. And it'll just show you how important a person that she was. They say that the Prince of Wales came to her. No, I don't believe that. But the very fact that it could be said that the Prince of Wales came to her, that will tell you how important a person she was. That the story is out there that the Prince of Wales came to her. No, she was that important. And she was only a poor woman living in a cottage in East Clare. So it's, and there's a very funny story. When a dispensary doctor, Biddy died in April 1874. In fact, I found her death cert by accident. In the next printing of this book now, I publish that. I don't think anybody has ever seen it since she died. I was looking for something else inside an Ennis courthouse, and I found it by pure accident. And she died April 1874. But a new dispensary doctor was appointed to Feakle in April 1874, and of course he was curious. He being a doctor, and she being a doctor of, you know, of that kind of poor people's medicine, he was curious. She had died earlier on in the year, so he went over to her house, which was unoccupied by then, and he leaves us quite an account of this avalanche of empty bottles down at the back of the house, because Biddy used to take drink from people in lieu of money, because people had no money who came to her. So she used to perform the cures for nothing. And people like that, like Biddy, who have a cure, they don't take money, but they'll take whatever you have. You know, if you have no money, they'll take a chicken, or they'll take a half a dozen eggs, or you know, they won't ask for anything. You offer it. It's the same with people who have a cure for blood, or for stopping blood, or for whatever it may be. you know, skin diseases or whatever it might be. That people like that are lucky. I presume that in Russia too. They're all over the world. People like that, and they're real. They're real. They're not imaginary. People. There's a man in Clare, and they say he had a cure for cancer. Yeah, yeah. But it was terribly painful, desperately painful. He used to burn it out. I don't think I liked the cure. He used to mix it up and literally he'd burn. Now it was skin cancer. He'd literally burn Curtis, I think was his name. And it was notable, notable. Now, there's one other. Can I, if you don't mind? Have you weasels in this country? The animal, weasels. Hmm?
Even as a bit.
Yes.
What would they be called in this country? No, the small ones, they're long. The little, Really? You do have them though?
Oh, sure.
Oh. We have them in Ireland, and they're a very strange animal because there's so many stories about them. They're almost human. And my next CD is going to be called The Small Book of Weasels. Because there are so many stories about them. Now, they're odd in the sense that a she-weasel, for example, is much more dangerous than a he-weasel. If a she-weasel spits on your head, you're guaranteed to go bald, for example. And that doesn't matter whether you're a man or a woman. If a she-weasel spits on your head, you're guaranteed to go bald. And you'd say, how could that be? Well, it could very easily, because they follow rabbits into rabbits' burrows. And sometimes, you know, in olden times, people used to hunt rabbits for eating, and they would put a ferret in. You can tame a ferret, you can't tame a weasel. They would put a ferret into a rabbit's burrow to hunt out the rabbits. Sometimes the ferret would stay inside, eating the rabbit. You wouldn't come out. So what people sometimes do, you know, they put their hand in, you know, to get out, little realizing that there'd be a weasel inside, and the weasel would, you know, your head would be exposed, so the weasel would spit on your head. And by the way, I remember very, very well, my father, he was a great fisherman, and he told me that I saw it, not that he told me at all. He was a very tidy man, and in his fishing bag there was lots and lots and lots of compartments, you know, for minnows and flies and gut and all the various things you need for fishing. But he would never allow us as children to go near his fishing bag. And of course, that would only make children more curious. Why? It was obvious why. He didn't want us to get caught in the hooks and all that. We didn't realise that. But my father was a harness maker, and he'd keep his fishing bag inside the counter. And never allow us inside the counter. If he caught us inside the counter, you know, we were going to get something we didn't like. But, of course, he wouldn't always be there. And finally, one day, we got in to have a look. We only found out the hooks, you know, the lead and hooks and flies and minnows and all very nicely kept. But at the bottom of the bag, we found this piece of timber, this piece of wood. Now, and I thought, why has my father a piece of wood, being such a tidy man, at the bottom of his fishing bag? Now, we didn't dare ask him, because he would realise that they have been rooting. But it was years later I found out why. Because a weasel, if a weasel grasps you, he will not let go. Their jaws lock when they grab you. And there's only one way to make a weasel let go, and that is have a stick and break it. And when a weasel hears the stick breaking, he thinks it's your bone breaking, and he'll let go. And that's why my father used to carry the piece of the stick, because, you know, sometimes when he'd be fly fishing back over a high bank, you know, just by bad luck, if a weasel happened to be behind him, you know, because there might be weasel nests in a high bank, if, you know, a weasel might come out and grab his hand, he would have the piece of stick to break, and the weasel would let him go. And my father wasn't a kind of a romantic, but he believed in that. Now, let me tell you a weasel story, and a very peculiar animal. They're like human beings. I talked to this woman, who's still very much alive, and she's not an old woman, and she had, up to recently, she told me, a sheepdog, pup, black and white sheepdog pup. And like any person, very fond of the pup. But she was afraid that he'd get killed by cars because, like most pups, he was stupid. Not stupid, just no sense. And, you know, dashing out in front of traffic, they get killed very easily. And what she used to do, since she was working woman, she'd be going out in the morning early and coming back late in the evening. So she liked to give the dog some exercise rather than having cooped up all day. She'd walk him in the morning and she'd walk him in the evening as she could. Now, he'd be cooped up then all day, but where she was living, it was a country road, and it was, you know, narrow road. And the way things have gone now in Ireland, you have a lot of lunatic drivers, crazy young fellas, and narrow roads are dangerous. And you know, as well as I do, you don't walk a dog walks you. You know, the way they'll be going this way and that way, and it was dangerous for her. So what she decided to do was talk to one of her neighbours, a farmer. Could she let the dog into his field if there was no cattle, and, you know, just allow the dog to run round, tire himself out? No problem, the farmer said, and that's what she began to do. And everything worked out fine, except this particular evening, she said, when she took in the dog to the field. Now, she would stand at the gate, close the gate behind her, so the dog wouldn't go out on the road again. There she was at the gate. The dog had gone off down, you know, the dog, you know, foolish pup, and on and on and on, dashing around, down, up and down again. All she wanted, tired himself out. And she was there, and then she noticed something strange. The dog had gone off down the field again, and suddenly the dog stopped. And she saw, coming out of the bushes and the ditch on that side. Now, remember, the ditch in Ireland is the opposite of the ditch. What do you call the ditch here? It's down, is it? Not in Ireland. The ditch is up. We step up on the ditch. In America or England, you step down into the ditch. Our ditch is up. You know, like a fence. The bushes are up on the ditch. So this group of animals came out from the ditch, and of course caught her attention immediately, since the dog had stopped. And, you know, she wondered, what were they? They looked like rats, and there was maybe 10 of them, and they were carrying something. One of them was carrying something up on its back, and, you know, she was wondering, what is that? And suddenly the dog started backing away towards her. Oh, strange. And these animals, you know, straight across the field. They didn't interfere with the dog in any way, but the dog kept backing away as if it was frightened. And then another group of these animals, out it came from the ditch. You know, maybe at a distance from me to you. Maybe 3-4 meters, and this time there were more of them, maybe 25 of them, and in the two groups straight across the field to the other ditch. crossed the ditch and into the next field, and she didn't see them anymore. And meanwhile, the dog had reached her, and there it was, you know, ooh, 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 frightened and shaking. And she took the dog home, wondering what in God's name was that. Now, she asked me the same question. Would I know what she had seen? And I said, yes, I do. What you saw was a weasel's funeral. A weasel's funeral. Because I heard from the old people that when a weasel dies, they hold a funeral. And the thing you saw up on his back, that was the dead weasel. And the first group, they were the family. And the ones coming up behind were the mourners. And how well the dog knew it, and knew enough to back away, because I said, if that dog had stayed where it was, they would have torn him apart. And if you had been in the way of that funeral, they would have torn you apart. They are an amazing animal. Strange animal. Yeah, yeah. But it works the other way too, with weasels. If you do them a favour, they can be a very, you know, they can come back and do you a favour. But an old man who only died 3 years ago at the age of 97, his name was Jim Blackwell, he said to me, if you take anything, if you steal anything from a weasel, and he told me a big, long story that happened to himself nearly 70 years ago. He said that if you steal anything from a weasel, it doesn't matter what protection you give yourself. You can have the strongest floorboards under you. You can have the strongest door. You will not keep them out. You will, and the first thing they'll do is by your throat. And he said, even an Alsatian dog is no match for a weasel, because it's the same thing. That's what they'll make for. He said, watch an Alsatian and a weasel, and an Alsatian will always run from a weasel. And a weasel is only that size. Any dog will run from a weasel, because he knows he will not win. They are an amazing, amazing little animal. I've only seen a weasel 3 times, always at night. And farmers, I've asked farmers time again, what do you think of weasels? And they'll always hesitate and they'll say, I don't like them because if you have them, you'll have no hens. But I like them because if you have them, you'll have no rats. There's 2 ways. They're good and they're bad at the same time. So they're a peculiar animal. Sorry, I should.
Eddie,
Yes.
when I was a little boy, Father O'Reilly said, don't tell stories, tell the truth. And so I go to tell the truth. You are the world's 2nd best storyteller. Do you know who the world's best storyteller is?
Tell me.
Auntie Shirley. She's as black as his boots. She's an Aboriginal in Sydney. And she came into the Gaelic League and she said, I've got the name Riley. I must have had an Irish great-great-grandfather. Could I join the Gaelic League? And Claire Dunn said, you have to ask the barman, he's the president. And so she went to the barman, she said, could I join? He said, of course. But does it matter that I'm black? He said, darling, if you don't tell them, they won't notice. Now, he said, but the price of getting in to the Gaelic League is to prove you're Irish by one story. The story takes less than a minute. She said, there had been a drought in Australia and no rain for 6 years, not a drop of it. And the police used to circle around to see if people were watering their gardens. It was illegal to put water on your roses. And she said, I had a grevillea, and I used to water it from the piss of my granddaughter's potty. And I was out there with the water going like this, and the policemen were standing there. And suddenly, she said, I felt a drop of rain on my cheek, and then another one on my forehead. And so she said, I quickly took off my blouse, my T-shirt, and as I'm 83, that was quite a sight. And as the policemen were there, she said, I started making up an Aboriginal dance. She went, and suddenly it started to rain. And the newspapers the next day said, Auntie Shirley did a rain dance, and Sydney is flooding now. And so they said, you can join the Gaelic League for that story. Now, only 5 of these certificates have ever been given away. Oh, incidentally, that makes him the best storyteller who is not an Aboriginal. Doesn't it? Only 5 of these have ever been given away. And we of the Project for Storytelling in Moscow would like you to accept our certificate. There's our founder. But that's another story.
Thank you so much for inspiring so many people in Moscow.
Because there'd be no stories without somebody to listen to them. And down all the years that I've been listening to people, older people, telling me their stories, it's been a pleasure too. And too many of them, of course, are dead and gone. But they're not dead and gone entirely when there's something of them left. When there's either book form or CD form or whatever form it be, even a told form, because I think of those people when I tell the story. Because we'll say some of the stories I told you there now tonight, there's one of them in particular I heard for that man, the Biddy Early story there. That man, would you believe, that told me that story, I heard it from him in a mental hospital. In a mental hospital. In Ennis Mental Hospital. That man is, again, long dead. But his stories, that's the first book I wrote long ago by Shannon Side. It's out of print now. But that man should never have been in hospital, in that hospital. And the great thing about him was that he pestered and pestered and pestered every government minister for help until finally one of them took notice. Barry Desmond, kind man that he was, and ordered his case to be reviewed. And of course he was released. He should never have been in there. But by then it was too late. You know, the old man was... But he had proved his point. I should never have been in here. And that's nice. That's nice when somebody at least, even at the end of their days, you know, I did something. And when that book came out, I remember I used to visit him on Sundays. He used to give the book away. Any chance you could get another one for me? Of course, I had to give him another one, and another one, and another one, and another one, and another one. I couldn't refuse because it was his book, after all. He was the one who supplied the stories, and he was delighted with it. Because again, that proved he wasn't a fool, he wasn't a mental patient. He was put in there by his family over land, which was all too often the case in Ireland at the time. So the stories I had and have, they came from various sources. So, thank you very much.
Thank you.